The Sharps Model 1859 rifle was no ordinary weapon. It was a technological marvel that turned precision into power. Its breech-loading mechanism allowed Berdan's sharpshooters to fire with unmatched speed, reloading from cover while their enemies fumbled with muzzle loaders. Its deadly accuracy, enhanced by double-set triggers and optional scopes, transformed these men into ghosts on the battlefield, striking from distances so great that Confederate officers fell before anyone heard the crack of the rifle. In the chaos of Gettysburg, this rifle wasn't just a tool. It was a force multiplier, a silent arbiter of life and death that gave Berdan's green-coated marksmen an almost supernatural edge. This is their story. The morning sun illuminated the distant ridgeline as I raised my field glasses, studying the terrain where Lee's army would surely emerge. I, Colonel Hiram Berdan, commander of the United States Sharpshooters, had spent 2 years molding these men into the finest marksmen the world had ever seen. Now, as the Army of the Potomac prepared to meet the Confederates at this small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg, I knew my green-coated specialists would prove their worth yet again. "Colonel Berdan, sir." Lieutenant William Elmendorf approached, his distinctive green uniform distinguishing him from the sea of Union blue surrounding us. "General Birney requests your presence." I lowered my glasses and nodded, surveying our camp where my men meticulously cleaned their rifles. Unlike the common soldier with his Springfield musket, my sharpshooters carried the Sharps breech-loading rifle, a marvel of engineering that had changed the face of warfare forever. "Tell the general, I'll be there momentarily," I replied, pausing to observe one of my newer recruits disassembling his Sharps with practiced precision. The Sharps rifle had been my insistence when forming these regiments. While the standard infantry soldier loaded his muzzle-loading rifle from the front, a cumbersome process requiring him to stand exposed, my men loaded from the breech. A simple lever action dropped the breech block, allowing the insertion of a paper cartridge. Close the lever, cock the hammer, and you were ready to fire. A good marksman could get off 3 aimed shots in the time it took a regular infantryman to load once. In this war, such efficiency meant the difference between life and death. I made my way to General Birney's headquarters, stepping around campfires where men boiled coffee in tin cups. The air was thick with tension. We all knew what was coming. After defeats at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the Army of the Potomac desperately needed a victory. Lee had brought the war to northern soil, and we had to stop him here. "Ah, Berdan," Birney greeted me, his voice betraying fatigue from the forced march that had brought us to Gettysburg. "I have a special assignment for your sharpshooters. It seems General Meade is uncertain about enemy positions west of here. I need your men to conduct a reconnaissance in force tomorrow morning." I nodded, understanding the implications. "You want us to draw them out, sir?" Birney smiled grimly. "Precisely. Your men move quietly, and they can defend themselves better than most if surprised. Take the 1st Regiment and 3 companies from the 2nd. Make contact with the enemy, identify their strength, and withdraw. Can you do this?" "We can, sir," I answered without hesitation, though I knew the danger such a mission entailed. Dawn broke on July 2nd as we advanced through the woods west of Gettysburg. I had positioned skirmishers ahead, their green uniforms blending with the foliage as they moved like hunters rather than soldiers. My sharpshooters didn't march in tight formation as regular infantry did. They utilized cover, moved independently, communicated with hand signals. These were the skills that set them apart. "Colonel," Captain Wilson whispered, pointing to a distant tree line where the morning light caught something metallic. "Rebel infantry, I'd wager." I raised my glasses and studied the area. Indeed, Confederate soldiers were forming up, thousands of them. This was no mere picket line, but a major force preparing to attack. "Pass the word quietly," I instructed. "We're going to occupy that rocky outcropping ahead. I want 20 men to move forward and establish range markers. The rest will form a skirmish line here." As my orders disseminated, I couldn't help but reflect on the unique men under my command. When forming the sharpshooter regiments in 1861, I had insisted on strict qualifications. Each recruit had to place 10 consecutive shots within a 10-inch circle from 200 yards. Men had come from all walks of life, hunters from Maine, farmers from Michigan, even a circus marksman from New York. Now they were the most feared marksmen in the Army. "Sir," my adjutant approached, interrupting my thoughts. "The men are in position." I nodded. "Very well. We'll advance slowly," and a sudden volley of musket fire erupted from the Confederate line. They had spotted us. "Hold position," I called out. "Return fire at will, aimed shots only." What happened next demonstrated why my sharpshooters were worth their weight in gold. Rather than panicking as most units might when surprised, they calmly took cover and began returning precise fire. The distinctive crack of the Sharps rifles echoed through the woods, each shot deliberate. I watched as a Confederate officer, easily a quarter-mile distant, raised his sword to rally his men. One of my sergeants, a former bear hunter from Vermont named Weston, adjusted his rear sight, took a breath, and squeezed his trigger. The officer dropped. Another Confederate moved to retrieve the fallen sword, and he too fell to a sharpshooter's bullet. "That'll give them pause," Weston muttered, already reloading with methodical efficiency. The effectiveness of the Sharps rifle wasn't just in its breech-loading mechanism, but in its accuracy. The percussion locks were perfectly aligned, the rifling and the barrels cut to exacting specifications. Each man carried a small wooden box containing percussion caps, paper cartridges, and a cake of beeswax to lubricate the paper. Some of my wealthier men had paid from their own pockets for telescopic sights, a novelty in warfare that allowed for accurate shooting beyond 800 yards. As the Confederate line advanced toward us, I realized we had uncovered something significant. This was Hood's division, part of Longstreet's corps, preparing for a major flanking movement against the Union left. "We've seen enough," I decided. "Begin withdrawal by squads, maintain covering fire." Just then, Confederate artillery opened up, shells whistling overhead and exploding among the trees. Splinters flew like daggers, and men dropped to the ground. "Move back to the next line of rocks," I shouted over the din. "Leapfrog withdrawal." My sharpshooters executed the maneuver with practiced precision, half the men falling back while the others provided covering fire, then reversing roles. The disciplined fire of my marksmen kept the Confederate infantry at bay, buying precious time. As we emerged from the woods near the peach orchard, I caught sight of a familiar figure on horseback, Major General Dan Sickles, commander of the 3rd Corps. "Colonel Berdan," he called out, trotting over as my men continued their orderly withdrawal. "What news?" "General Longstreet's entire corps is massing for an attack on your flank," I reported, pointing back toward the woods. "At least a division, possibly more, with artillery support." Sickles, a former New York politician whose military experience was questionable at best, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Then I shall advance my line to that higher ground ahead. Better position." I looked where he pointed, a slight ridge beyond the peach orchard, and frowned. The move would extend his line dangerously far from the main Union position on Cemetery Ridge. "Sir, with respect, that position is isolated. You'd be vulnerable from multiple sides." Sickles waved away my concern. "I know what I'm doing, Colonel. Your sharpshooters did well. Now form them on the left of that brigade there." As he rode off, one of my captains muttered, "That man's ambition will get us all killed." I couldn't disagree, but orders were orders. "Form the men along that stone wall," I directed. "I want squads spaced 20 yards apart. Conserve ammunition. No shots beyond 500 yards unless at officers or artillery crews." Over the next hour, we watched as Sickles advanced his entire corps forward, creating a salient, a bulge in the line that could be attacked from multiple directions. A textbook military blunder if I'd ever seen one. "The generals play their chess game," I remarked to my adjutant, "and we pieces must move accordingly." "Some pieces move more cunningly than others, sir," he replied with a slight smile. I chuckled despite the gravity of our situation. "Indeed, and my sharpshooters are the knights on this board, mobile, unexpected, and precise in their strikes." By mid-afternoon, the Confederate attack began in earnest. A massive artillery barrage preceded waves of gray-clad infantry emerging from the woods. My sharpshooters, positioned along stone walls and behind trees, began their deadly work. I observed one of my best men, Private Timothy Murphy from New York, as he calmly loaded his sharps. Unlike the standard rifle musket that required a soldier to bite off the end of a paper cartridge, pour powder down the barrel, ram a bullet on top, and then place a percussion cap on the nipple, all while standing exposed, Murphy simply pulled down his breech block, inserted a cartridge, closed the block, and was ready to fire. "Steady, men," I called out. "Make every shot count." The metallic click of falling breech blocks and the sharp crack of rifles created a syncopated rhythm across our line. Through my field glasses, I watched Confederate officers fall with alarming regularity, their distinctive insignia making them prime targets for my marksmen. "Sir," Murphy called out after dropping a Confederate color bearer at nearly 600 yards, "I believe I could disrupt their artillery if I had a better position." I surveyed the field and spotted a small copse of trees that offered both cover and a clear line of sight to the enemy batteries. "Take 4 men. Make it count." Murphy nodded, his weathered face displaying neither fear nor excitement, just the focused determination of a professional. As he moved off with his small team, I turned my attention to our increasingly precarious position. Sickles' advance line was buckling under the Confederate assault. The regiments to our right began a fighting withdrawal, and soon we were in danger of being flanked. "Colonel," a courier galloped up, his horse lathered with sweat. "General Birney's compliments, and you are to fall back to the main line on Cemetery Ridge immediately." "About time," I muttered. "Pass the word. Withdrawal by companies. Maintain covering fire." As my sharpshooters began their disciplined retreat, covering each other in sequence, I searched for Murphy's team. Through the smoke, I spotted them still at work in their advanced position. Murphy had evidently found the range to the Confederate artillery, as I observed several gunners fall in quick succession, disrupting their fire. But they were now in danger of being cut off. "Lieutenant Cole," I called to a nearby officer, "take 20 men and recover Murphy's team." As Cole moved off, the main Confederate attack slammed into Sickles' salient. The fighting became desperate, hand-to-hand in places, as the Confederates pressed their advantage. My sharpshooters, never meant for close-in fighting, were nonetheless holding their own, using their Sharps rifles as clubs when enemies got too close. I found myself drawing my revolver as a group of Confederates broke through nearby. 6 quick shots emptied my Colt, and then I too was wielding my rifle as a club. A Mississippi private lunged at me with his bayonet, but years of mechanical precision work had made my hands quick. I parried the thrust and struck him with the rifle butt, not hard enough to kill, but sufficient to send him stumbling back. "Colonel," a voice called out. It was Cole supporting a wounded Murphy. "We got them all, sir, but Murphy took a ball in the shoulder." "It's nothing, Colonel," Murphy grimaced. But I lost my ramrod. I laughed at his joke even in the midst of the chaos. "We'll requisition you another if we survive this, Private." "Oh, we'll survive," he said with surprising certainty. "My Sharps and I have an agreement to keep shooting straight, and I keep it clean." Even in the heat of battle, I appreciated the humor. This was characteristic of my sharpshooters, calm professionals who treated their deadly work with a craftsman's pride. As we fell back toward Cemetery Ridge, I glanced back at the devastation of Sickles' salient. His corps was in tatters, his ambitious advance having nearly led to disaster. Only the timely arrival of reinforcements from the 5th Corps had prevented a complete breakthrough. We established a new position on the main Union line as evening approached. My sharpshooters, despite being in the thick of fighting, had suffered fewer casualties than most infantry regiments. Their skill, their weapons, and their tactics had served them well. "Colonel Berdan," a staff officer approached. "General Meade sends his compliments and wishes to know the results of your morning reconnaissance." I looked at the young officer wearily. "Tell the general that we identified Longstreet's corps and their attack axis precisely. Had actions been taken immediately on our intelligence, perhaps today's near disaster could have been avoided." The officer blenched at my frankness but nodded and rode off. "You shouldn't speak so plainly about the general, sir," my adjutant admonished gently. "It's not diplomatic." I inspected a bullet hole in my coat sleeve, a close call I hadn't even noticed in the heat of battle. "Diplomacy is for politicians, Lieutenant. In my previous life as an inventor, what mattered was mechanical truth, what works and what doesn't. The same applies to war." "And what works, sir?" I gestured to where my men were cleaning their Sharps rifles, even in the gathering darkness. "Precision, skill, innovation, not blind adherence to outdated tactics." As night fell over Gettysburg, I knew the battle was far from over. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, more fighting, more death. But as I looked at my green-coated sharpshooters, hunters, farmers, and marksmen from across the Union, now transformed into the most elite fighting force in the Army, I felt a peculiar pride. We had changed warfare forever. The age of standing in neat lines to exchange volleys was ending. The future belonged to skilled marksmen with advanced weapons, men who could strike with deadly precision from concealment. My sharpshooters were harbingers of this new era. I checked my own Sharps rifle, working the action and wiping it clean. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it the thunder of artillery and the storm of battle. But my sharpshooters would be ready, positioned like the eye of that storm, calm, focused, and deadly accurate.